Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure and an honor for me to speak at such a distinguished event. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and a great honor. Let me start with sharing my presentation here, and what I thought I would do in the next half an hour or so is to introduce to you or share with you a few thoughts that I had on the impact of the pandemic on supply chain management in general, and then also the logistics industry in particular. And I divided my thoughts into three parts. First, kind of the precursor to the pandemic, what maybe companies could have done differently, why so many companies were so severely hit. The second part of my thoughts then focuses on what was the real impact on the pandemic, and I will illustrate that with a number of examples, and then what are the takeaways. In the last part of my presentation I will share a few ideas and suggestions of how supply chains, how logistics infrastructures can become more resilient and more robust, so that companies are better prepared for the future. So how did we get here, the time before the pandemic? In my view, supply chain management has been practiced for many decades now, but especially the last 2 decades, they have been fairly comfortable for many companies. And that's what led many companies to take the management part out of the term supply chain management. They didn't really manage the supply chain anymore. And when you look at it, the companies cannot really be blamed for it, because it was a very stable and predictable environment. Yes, there were certainly significant tragedies and disruptions to supply chains, such as the earthquake in Japan and the subsequent tsunami, hurricanes Rita and Katrina that we had here, floods in Thailand, and so on. And by no means I want to belittle these events. These had significant impacts on human life and supply chains as well. But overall, these events were isolated. They were relatively quickly overcome. And what is also different, that not the entire world was impacted by these challenges. So companies tended to forget quite quickly what they might have learned from the impact of these crises back then. What also led to this is because companies increasingly have been focusing on the cost dimension, neglecting that that might not be everything, that you might also have to put some resources into risk management, in maybe developing redundant logistics networks, redundant supply chains, that if one logistics route is out of the picture, if that falls out for whatever reason, that you then can fall back to alternate logistics routes, alternate supply chains, alternate suppliers. So this geographic diversification, for example, that many companies kind of went to after especially the tragedy in Japan, that kind of was reverted a few years later, because companies felt, well, I'm spending all of this money on this redundancy and nothing has happened, so I might as well just focus on a sole source, on a single source supplier, sourcing from one particular country, and put all of my eggs into one basket or in one supply chain. So this short-term focus, this focus on cost in the short term, this has really led for risk management to be put on the back burner, and for companies to not worry about too much. And companies realized, they experienced that they fared very well with it. Because again, while risks certainly manifested, while tragedies certainly happened, they were largely isolated and quickly overcome by most of the companies. So this is why a lot of companies were caught off guard. There are, however, some notable exceptions, such as the retailer HEB, headquartered in Texas and quite popular in the southern states of the US. And they were really a poster child of preparedness for responding to the pandemic. They learned their lesson, and it goes all the way back to 2009 when we had the H1N1 flu here, and that triggered them to prepare a pandemic response action plan. A pandemic response action plan. Think about that. They had that plan now in the drawer and could pull it out. Obviously, it had to be updated, but who would have thought that such an event, such a huge event, a significant event, would really upset the entire world. Very few companies even thought about that. But AGB was one notable example that had been thinking about that. So within a week, within 10 days, they were up and running and had their emergency response team responding to the challenges that were just getting started in the supply chain. So they were able to hit the ground running. So it was as early as February 2nd when they ran their first simulations of what this deadly disease would do within the state of Texas. And in February 2nd, probably many of us just heard about that in the news. February 2nd, that was also when the first death occurred out of China. But at that time, HEB was up and running, and they implemented a lot of initiatives very, very proactively compared to a lot of their competitors or to industry in general. So what they were doing, they were studying how the Chinese government was responding to this crisis, to this pandemic, and the effectiveness of various measures that we unfortunately all have become too familiar with right now in terms of social distancing, crowd control, plexiglass, and so on. So they studied that in China. They also looked at Europe and looked at how consumer demand, how retailers' demand was impacted by the consumers, by hoarding, by buying toilet paper in bulk, for example. And so they looked at other countries where the pandemic was present earlier and how they reacted, and kind of then built their strategies surrounding with these inputs in place. They also implemented a coronavirus hotline for employees, because in these early days there were a lot of questions. There was a lot of uncertainty. So they dedicated a hotline for employees where they could educate themselves of how to stay safe, because these were some of the frontline workers in the supermarkets that had to stock the shelves. HEB, however, was also benefiting from a whole foundation of resilience and robustness. For example, they had on their regular staff a director of emergency preparedness, as well as a chief medical officer. I don't think a whole lot of companies have a CMO on their staff. They also had a fleet of mobile generators and water tankers that they could now deploy, having learned from, they were in Texas, having learned from the catastrophes of hurricanes and Katrina and Rita that have been wreaking havoc in the southern states, where they have a lot of their stores. They have learned from that, and they invested in their own fleet of generators and tankers. They also owned their meat packing facilities. We've been seeing all across the world, here in the US, but also in Europe, that there are a lot of infections going on in meat packing plants. But they also recognized that after H1N1, that this was an industry, a link in the supply chain that was very, very kind of vulnerable to these kind of impacts. So they made this decision, again, not taking the easy way out, not taking the cheap way out. They owned the meatpacking facilities, and they were very transparent, the last bullet point here, in that they publish the number of coronavirus cases by store. If one of the employees got infected, they're listed publicly. I think so overall, AGB kind of hit the ground running. That it can really serve as a poster child of how to respond to the crisis, how to be prepared in the first place. But of course, that was the exception. A lot of companies suffered from disruption in their supply chains. And I just took some statistics here from the World Bank, where you can see the percent of firms that experienced a decrease of supply of inputs, quite significant. When you look at here, Russia, Mongolia, countries all across the world, in terms of Europe, in terms of African countries. The US and Korea, they weren't part of the survey yet, so they didn't have data on those countries, but I can imagine fairly comparable when you see some of these statistics here. So what companies therefore have been considering, if you move here to the right-hand side of that slide, they've been reconsidering alternate sources, specifically retracting from China and establishing other supply chains that go to other countries to hedge the risk. However, this might also not be the answer. Certainly withdrawal from China, while that was certainly a first and understandable knee-jerk, so to say, reaction, that wouldn't be possible. It just would not be feasible to build up these capabilities in other countries overnight. It requires a lot of planning and investment and so on. So that wouldn't necessarily be possible. So companies have to be creative, and I'll get to that in one of the later slides. Companies need to be to become creative and not only rely on one supply chain, let's say to China, but also to other kind of duplicate that supply chain with maybe another supply chain. Maybe source 50% of your capacity from China, another 25% from a neighboring country, and yet another 25% maybe domestically. Again, that costs money, that is more expensive, but it might be worth the investment to develop a more robust and more resilient supply chain. And after all, some companies benefited also from having Chinese presence, having Chinese suppliers or Chinese subsidiaries, such as this German producer of vacuum pumps. They learned from their Chinese subsidiary that they had there what was going on. Especially in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of messages, and a lot of people didn't know what was going on. So this company, however, they leveraged their presence in the Chinese market through their Chinese subsidiary to learn what was going on, how were people impacted. And they knew very early on about the importance of personal protective equipment. So before the run on masks and sanitizers happened, they secured for all of their employees and their families in all of their subsidiaries in Europe PPE, so that they were well prepared. They also proactively secured inventory much earlier than other companies were able to do that, because they had this first-hand insight into the supply chain in China and what was happening there. Another proactive case that I came across is this Italian company of high-precision manufacturing tools, and they were unfortunate in that regard that they had one of the first COVID-19 cases in Italy, but that kind of triggered them to be extra careful, to be extra proactive. So what they did, they now kind of felt it firsthand that this was real, this was a real danger. So they implemented a COVID committee of developing best practices that they then also widely shared with others in the industry to be better prepared and to ensure the safety and health of their employees. They were also one of the first companies that implemented remote working, even for even for functions such as quality management, quality control. They figured out how that could be done remotely as well. And they were one of the first companies that went virtual with their customers as well. So the salespeople didn't travel as much anymore, but much more was put on the computer, on the virtual kind of interface. So these companies, they yet again present some examples of companies that were hit very early on, but that were able to manage the crisis by this quick response, by this quick reaction, by first of all proactively seeking the information, like the German company connecting with their Chinese subsidiary, and this rapid redeployment of initiatives, such as the COVID committee for the Italian company. So this is how some companies were able to react and respond to the pandemic. Unfortunately, one group of companies that has been particularly hard hit are the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises, because they were hit on two sides. First of all, from the supply side, they might not have been able to get the needed material that they needed to produce the final products, but then also on the customer side, because a lot of these small businesses, they rely on local customers that frequent their shops, and that demand that came to a halt because of the mandate to self-isolate and to not socialize as much. So that has come to a huge shock for small and medium-sized enterprises. We analyzed a survey in one of our research projects from the NDA, the National Defense Industry Association. It's focused on suppliers in the defense industry, and they conducted a survey in the early months of the pandemic of what the these SME suppliers were experiencing. And as you can see here in the top left corner, big impact on revenue expectations, the ability to secure access to financial capital. Banks were now hesitant to be extending loans to them unless it came from the government. A lot of governments implemented these loans for small businesses. But they were also concerned about the ability to perform to the contract, because they themselves didn't get the needed input materials. The availability of a sufficient and qualified workforce was concerned, because people also felt concerned of going back to work, because also of the concern of providing a safe and secure facility. So overall, SMEs have been particularly hard hit, but many governments, many countries have realized that these SMEs, they are the backbone of industry, of innovation, and have put into place small business loans for them to weather this current crisis. What some of these companies, especially small and medium-sized companies, have therefore also been doing, rather than only relying on this financial assistance, they have been trying to diversify, to adjust or convert their products or services. And again, here some statistics from the World Bank showing you some percentages from these countries. You see here also some big differences, but on average, around 20, 30, up to 50% of the companies surveyed, they were adjusting or considering of converting their products and services to respond to the current crisis. And some companies were fairly creative in these endeavors. So for example, here this Chinese supermarket chain that created thousands of self-pickup stations based at community centers and local convenience stores. So first of all, making it convenient for the consumers, that they didn't have to travel to the grocery store, but that they had these pickup centers in place. They also reduced the number of stock keeping units so that they could deploy the inventory much more quickly, and that was a huge benefit. Kroger and Amazon's Whole Foods here in the US, they also saw a steep decline in customer traffic in their stores because everyone was staying at home, everyone was ordering things online, and therefore they converted a number of their stores into so-called dark stores that were only used as pretty much a staging location, as an inventory location for online order fulfillment. So companies have been getting creative. And then there are the stories of the distilleries, wineries, and breweries that have been producing hand sanitizer because of the alcohol they are producing there. And these include huge companies such as Diageo or even local producers. We have a lot of local distilleries and breweries here in Michigan, and they all kind of jumped on that and kind of were creative, and to compensate for some of the business, some of the revenue that they had to forego now with the current pandemic. Again, an example of a company that needs to be applauded for their initiative of responding to the crisis, General Motors and their partnership with Ventec. This was the initiative here in the US of encouraging automobile manufacturers to retool and to produce ventilators, because in the early days, as you all remember, they were in very short supply. So within a matter of 11 days, GM and Ventec were able to source the material, convert an entire manufacturing facility to the production of these ventilators, and train the workers. So within less than 11 days, they were up and running with that production. And in about 150 days, they completed the entire order of 30,000 ventilators that the US government placed on them. I had the pleasure of interacting with one of the team members that was responsible for that initiative, and she said it was a very, very kind of stressful time, these 11 days. She didn't sleep a whole lot, but she also said the support that it received from the companies was just tremendous. They had an open checkbook. Doesn't matter what it costs, we are saving lives here. So a tremendously stressful and intense situation, but then also very, very rewarding in the end of pulling that together with the help of suppliers, with the help of the supply chain, of course. Now, where do we go from here? What are some strategies going forward? As you saw now, as well with some of the examples, especially the recent example that I mentioned, a lot of it hinges on your relationships with your suppliers. If GM had not had such great relationships with their supply base, they might have run into more difficulties in pulling that together. So supplier relationship management, or SRM, matters. You need to be concerned with the long-term health of the supplier by providing them proactive mutual assistance in terms of loans, for example, in terms of engineering help. And we have not only been seeing that now in the current crisis, but going back about 12 years, 2008, 2009, with the Great Recession, we also saw, especially here in Michigan, that great buyer-supplier relationships matter. Because then these companies help each other out. For example, if a buyer saw that a supplier was struggling, a supplier was close to bankruptcy, then the buyer would maybe pay the supplier earlier for the deliveries, maybe even before they received the goods. They would pay them in advance. And vice versa, if the supplier saw that a buyer was struggling, maybe a small enterprise, then they relaxed some of the payment terms and didn't enforce any penalty fees if the buyer didn't pay on time. So this is really the foundation, the basis for responding to crises like these. Companies certainly can try it themselves, but it's likely much more powerful, much more successful if buyers and suppliers pull on the same strings and help each other out. And that can be done by sharing information, communicating frequently and openly, and keeping each other up to date, developing trust. What is the mantra of the day for a buying company is to earn preferential treatment and to become a customer of choice. This is very different to 20 or 30 years ago, where the buyer usually had the upper hand and the supplier had to do whatever the buyer demanded. Now, oftentimes, it's shifted to the supplier side, the balance of power, where the buyer needs to be nice, where the buyer needs to treat the supplier fairly and equitably, which makes sense. But we also saw that now in the pandemic, especially with the shortages of supply, which many companies felt. And if a supplier received a delivery and then they had to distribute it to their customers, who would get the first shipment? Well, it would be those customers that treated the supplier well, those customers of choices, those customers, those buyers that earn preferential treatment. And this was again illustrated here in this crisis. And again, there are many examples out there. I just provided two here. A French cosmetic manufacturer, they helped more than 100,000 of their customers, small salons, small and medium-sized enterprises. They helped them out not only with financial resources, with loans, but also operational support and HR support, providing guidelines of how to reopen again with safety in mind. And then there was this Turkish manufacturer of furniture that leveraged its network and its stakeholders to create an open source online guidebook. So similar to the Italian company that I mentioned before, in that they kind of developed best practices, they developed processes, guidelines, routines of how to best tackle this challenge that all the companies were experiencing, and then they made it available. Then they made it an open source online guidebook. And that is only possible if everyone kind of pulls together, if everyone contributes, and this is why supplier relationship management is so paramount. We also need to broaden our understanding of risk and create a risk management culture. What I mean with that is not a company that easily takes risks. This is not meant with that. What it means is that a company understands that risks are part and parcel of doing business, high risks, high rewards, and that companies plan for that risks might indeed manifest, that risks might happen. So there needs to be this awareness, and there needs to be contingency plans in place that could then be pulled out and adapted to respond to the situation, just as HEB did. So companies need to focus on enterprise and system-wide risks, not only being concerned about themselves or maybe their first-tier suppliers, but also look farther up in the supply chain, second-tier, third-tier suppliers, because it only needs one of those tiers to fail and you might not be able to deliver your product. Also rethink supply chain designs, making them more robust, making them maybe more redundant, that you have different transportation routes, that you maybe have different ports of entry into a country to hedge the risk that maybe one port of entry might not be available. And then develop this risk management culture. A great enabler in this regard is, of course, information technology. And one of the companies that recognized that early on was Sevo. They are a data analytics company that provides software for data analytics, for spend analysis. And within a matter of a weekend, they overlaid their existing modules with this coronavirus platform that simply takes the data from Johns Hopkins University and overlays them with the countries indicating which countries are currently hot zones, and then kind of matching that up with the supplier database that the company has. So the company can proactively seek out to those suppliers in a red zone and maybe ask them, what are your plans? What are your contingency plans? Are you planning to stay open? Can you kind of divert inventory from somewhere else to me so that it's made up in times in case there's a disruption? So this information technology is a great enabler, especially when it comes to risk management. And then lastly, globalization. There's definitely the need for geographical diversification, as I indicated in one of my first examples, that you not put all your eggs in one supply chain, that you not only source from one country or one geographic region, but that you build robustness into that and maybe dual source or maybe even triple source from different locations, maybe even internalizing some of that capacity so that you have some emergency capability. Reconsider the focus on outsourcing and offshoring. There's certainly always a risk associated with that. A lot of articles have been discussing, especially here in the US, is this notion of reshoring, of bringing back manufacturing because overseas locations are just too risky, simply from being farther away, limited ability control, and also, as we've been seeing right now with the pandemic, that's why a lot of companies in the early days flocked to kind of pushing for reshoring again. However, this prediction didn't materialize. There have been a number of articles written, like this one, where I provided a snapshot from the Financial Times, that this didn't happen. Because, as I also indicated before, it's not that easy. You cannot just withdraw from an entire country or an entire region and build up the capability overnight in your domestic location. That is not feasible. So it's not kind of either or kind of an approach, but companies need to be creative. They need to be flexible. They need to be developing redundant supply chains, multi-pronged supply chains, to be able to be more robust and more resilient in the future, to be better able to respond to crises like we are currently experiencing. And lastly, some final thoughts. In times of crisis, system choke points are revealed, serving as reminders for the importance of certain topics, such as globalization, risk management, and supplier relationship management. Going back to my opening remarks, the management within supply chain management had probably been neglected by many companies because they were comfortable environments, they were forgiving environments, and it didn't matter. However, in times of crisis, these choke points are revealed, kind of illustrating what is really important and what companies should be focusing on going forward. Now with that, this is all that I had prepared. I hope it was insightful. I hope it was valuable. And with that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have.